Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Sunoikisis's Digital Classics Summer 2022. Today we have our seventh session of this semester, and this session again is about, let's say, digital cultural heritage in some way. And we have a new guest today from South Africa, and the session today, the title of the session is South Africa, Greece and Rome, Classical Confrontations in the Digital Age. And today we will see a nice discussion about the preservation of data about the ancient classical objects in South African museums. And this is the reason why today we have Samantha Masters from Stellenbosch University with us. Unfortunately, she can't share the screen, but she's with us, and we will be able to hear her voice and see her slides and her presentation. And Samantha is a scholar of classical material culture at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She's an expert in this field, and so today she will talk about collecting objects in museums in South Africa. But today we also have Franziska Nether from Leipzig. She's an Egyptologist. She works at the Saxony Academy of Science. Sorry, I was looking for the English version of it. And Franziska, of course, you know her because she has been participating in many sessions of Sunoikis. And then, of course, Gabriel Bodar and Monica Perti, but I don't need to introduce ourselves. Okay, so I think we can start, and Franziska will introduce the session. So thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Franziska, for being with us today. And I think we can start with Franziska.
Hello, everyone on the screens, dear colleagues. It's great to be back. It's Untitled again this term, and I have the honor of course, we do not do formal introductions in Untitled, but I have the honor to give you a short intro what Samantha Masters is working on, because we both are at the same department. I am from time to time working as a research associate at the Ancient Studies Department at Stellenbosch University as well, and just had the pleasure to be there for 5 weeks in March and April to collaborate with Samantha Masters on a project, which no doubt she will elaborate a little bit on that before. But to give you a short intro, I have compiled a few slides. Samantha is senior lecturer, that as Monica already said, and we are co-working in publishing and teaching on the cultural heritage from the Cape. So this session is going to be a very exciting topic also for those of you working on classical material. That means Greek, Roman artifacts, but also beyond, also Egyptian, Mesopotamian artifacts, because the Cape and the collections there have a lot to offer that I guess a lot of scholars are not aware about so far. So the mission today is also to change that a little bit and introduce to the wealth of the collections and also the projects and the ongoing research that is there, especially by Samantha Masters. And I'd like to introduce you only to one collection that some of you might have heard about. The Stellenbosch University at the Western Cape has a long-standing collaboration with Ezekiel Museums. This is a group of museums quite similar to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And these museums have a couple of ancient artifacts, mostly one that is called the so-called Slave Lodge, the South African Cultural History Museums. Only a few objects of these are online. Much is still unpublished, and we have the goal to use these artifacts in research and teaching and make the material from the Cape visible. It's very often fascinating material, and also the histories of Egyptian can be very, very interesting because they are intertwined, of course, into colonial history, but also into the history of certain individuals that are quite well known in especially European scholarly circles. And another thing that is very interesting that a lot of people might not know about so far is that the artifacts or the imagery of the ancient world shares a unique history of the reception of classical in classical imagery, or in the art of reception, and also in activist art of contemporary South Africa. So to show you a few slides that are partly well known to those who have attended our lectures or who are part of us in South Africa. It started all with something called the Greek Room in the South African Cultural History Museum. This has been much more elaborated. So this is sort of a legacy showcase. And what we sometimes do is in class going to the stacks of the collections with the students to introduce them to the collection. We have a couple of iconic photographs like that with Professor Cornelius. And of course, you can see also Dr. Masters here, Dr. Esmiel and the colleagues from the Ezekiel Museum. And we have a couple of photographs like that since newer and newer generations of scholars are coming to the collection, have a look at it, work at the stacks, create fact sheets of the artifacts. And what we have done recently is also 3D modeling. Yeah, to collect metadata and data about artifacts is, of course, something that's very dear to us in Syneukisis and in digital humanities in general. And this is also done in collaboration with other colleagues. This is something that Sam will no doubt elaborate on today. To co-work with colleagues in Stanford. Many of you know that Stanford libraries have an elaborate digital program, for instance, for digital exhibitions and knowledge bases. And we also do contribute to some of these as well. And the students can contribute to this also by working with the objects, with creating 3D models. Anyone who is interested in cultural heritage imaging and 3D modeling, I totally recommend the lectures from the Syneukisis session last fall and winter term, especially the session that Gabi shared with the colleagues from the Fitzwilliam Museum and the British Museum. I really recommend this as an introduction, and the sessions following with it if you're keen on these topics, because that's something that we also had a look at in South Africa before we did that. These are here now pictures from 2018, but we did similar classes in 2019 and also now in 2022, and presented these in greater context also to the public and everyone who was interested also outside the university. And why do we do this? Because it's part of modules in excuse me, in teaching, how students can look at ancient art to learn about theory of ancient cultures, about the sources, to develop visual literacy and so on. So the aims of these classes are listed here on this folder. And also, of course, to learn about 3D imaging, because that might be potential fields of study that might interest the students on their further career as scholars or in whatever fields they might end up. Yeah, I'm really happy that we can do this session today. And coming back on here, and I like to hand over to Samantha Masters at this point. We're really excited to have you here for the first time.
Okay, thank you, Francisca. So I think, Samantha, you should switch on your microphone because you are muted, and I don't know if you are talking. So we wait for Samantha. We had a few problems before with the connection, so let's see. Samantha, can you hear us?
Hi there. I'm so sorry.
No problem. So, okay, you're back. And if you can share your slides, because I still see your screen. I mean, your... Okay, excellent. It works now. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Apologies for that. I'm quite new at this method of delivering presentations. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting to be able to talk about this project, which is something I've been working on for some time, but with a lot of collaboration from students and colleagues. So it really is an exciting collaboration it started as my idea, one person's idea, and now it's grown. And I'm really grateful to all of the input that I've had. And I'm hoping for some wonderful input from yourselves. I have my notebook right next to me here, and I'm going to frantically write down suggestions. Because what I also need to say is that although I've been working in digital humanities, it's not my primary field. I work with material culture, I work on collections, and I work on not just collections and museums currently, but I work on ancient artifacts as well, on iconography. So the digital humanities aspect is something that I have a lot to learn about. So if I use very strange terminology, please forgive me. I thought what I would do is start off with an overview of collecting classical antiquities in South Africa. So the project that was first conceptualized. And then I thought I would talk about the goals and the phases of the project. And it sort of has changed direction in some ways. And then I'll say where we currently are. And then, if there's time, reflect and talk about future aims. And in between, Francisca, will you come in and stop me wherever you want to, if you want to have a conversation about something?
All right, it's possible.
Okay. Apologies for the neighborhood noises. We have a very unstable Wi-Fi situation and power situation in South Africa at the moment. And so I had to set up where I could best get signal. So I do apologize for birds and dogs. Okay, so an overview of the project. Where did the idea come from? It started with Grant Parker at Stanford, who is a South African and has always remained connected with classics and South Africa. And he wanted to put together this volume on South Africa, Greece, Rome, classical confrontations. And he approached me about the antiquities in South Africa. And he said, what have we got and where is it? And that's got me thinking, because I went to a university, not where I currently am, Stellenbosch. I went to the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Durbin, and we had a collection, which was a teaching collection. But apart from that collection, I didn't know very much of what else was in the country, except I knew of a collection in Cape Town at the National Museum. But strangely, I'd never seen it, even though I'd visited Cape Town when I was a child. So that thought began the whole project, where I said to him, I will investigate, I will write an overview of what is where, and I will focus on two main collections. So the article that emerged from that was called Museum Space and Displacement, Collecting Classical Antiquities in South Africa. And it started a desire to move further into the information about the collections, but not just that. What I discovered while I was looking for objects, or at that point looking for information on where the objects were, I realized that many of the objects and many of the collections were not in anybody's attention. So they had, some of the collections had previously held some authority or been interesting in colonial museums, had been set up as part of collections like European collections, world collections. But after 1994, which was when we had our first democratic elections, there was new legislation related to heritage, and there was a shift towards local heritage and towards what they called neglected heritage, which I completely agree with. So what had happened is the museums, local museums, had previously displayed the objects of local South African culture in a way in which they were separated from world culture and from even from what they called at the time, and this language dates back to even the early 1900s, civilized societies and non-civilized societies. So these objects from Europe were not strictly problematized as negative, but the thinking was to prioritize and to look from Africa, from local outward rather than the other way around. And so it's within that kind of context that I was trying to track down collections and work out whether this kind of political thinking and rethinking, the rethinking of heritage, had mattered, had made any difference to where these collections went. And there was a definite shift in ideology, and I wanted to track down where these collections currently were. So I started with the Cape Town collection because by that stage I'd become very familiar with it. So when I studied, I didn't know much about the collection, but coming to Stellenbosch, I started uncovering the wonderful objects at Ezekiel, and have been taking students, as Francisca said, been taking students there and been working on objects. So they are very familiar to me now. So I started there and I traced the collection from the originally in the South African Museum to the South African Cultural History Museum, which is the image on the right, which used to be a courtroom, and before that it was actually the slave lodge for slaves that were kept at the Cape during colonial times. And so a building with a very negative heritage. This is the Greek room, which Francisca also referred to. This is where the objects were from the 1960s till the early 2000s, when it was decided to return the building to its identity as a slave lodge and talk about this heritage of slavery, this kind of chapter which nobody wanted to really acknowledge and talk about. And so it has become a slave lodge, and it tells the story of slavery in South Africa. And over time, the building has been changed. So it wasn't a revamp immediately. Initially, the bottom floor was changed, and this is where the Greek and Roman and Egyptian artifacts were, and they were moved out, and other slavery exhibitions were introduced. So this was in the early 2000s, and the Antiquities went into storage in the building which is known as the Ezekiel Social History Center. So there are a lot of objects that are stored there. As we know, not every object a museum owns is ever all on display at the same time. So they have stores, and that's where the objects are now. This is what they look like. So that was one story I wanted to investigate, and I wanted to track all the documentation, all the data I could find about the objects. I could find the objects, and the data was fairly accessible. But for some other collections, this was definitely not the case. And that is why I decided this has to be digitized. It has to be kept, because the Ezekiel Collection, for example, are well looked after, but in some of the smaller museums where the objects are simply in boxes, the information is hard to find. These objects are going to be lost to the world. The objects themselves may remain, but at some point nobody will know what they really are. So it became a kind of mission of mine to preserve the data, and at least in the digital form to preserve the object. The second collection that I looked at very closely in that article was the collection from my own university. So from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, classics department museum where I studied, and I was a kind of assistant curator to these objects when I was a student there. So the collection was fairly familiar. And here there was a different story to tell, and that is because the Department of Classics was the actual museum was part of the Department of Classics, and it had managed to remain open. Several classics departments in South Africa have been under threat, so this is another issue of sort of disappearing relevance of a subject that we are trying to combat. And with that, the objects themselves are also precarious. So for now, this collection is fairly safe. It's still in its museum cases, and it is accessible. That's what the little museum looks like. So it's a very small museum. It's a foyer of a department. The offices open off there. So those are the two collections that I surveyed, and I realized from the other information collecting that there were two different types. There were state collections, and then there were collections that were housed by departments. Okay, so that initiated a project which I got funding for from the National Research Foundation in South Africa. And that is where I started looking more carefully for data and looked into the history and reception of all the collections that I could find. So going back to about the 1820s, when the earliest museums started in South Africa with the British colonial government, bringing institutions to mimic the kinds of institutions that were in the motherland, so to speak. So the museum basically does arrive, the concept of the museum does arrive with colonialism. So from that funded project of collecting information, as much types of documents, as many types of documents as possible, photographs, minutes of meetings, handwritten notes. It's quite an array of data. I started a database, which I've just called conveniently and not very imaginatively, the South African Classical Antiquities Database. So this is where I've started to put together the information in one place. And I wanted to make it so that the data could be safe, that the data that I had collected in different ways and which students and other colleagues had helped me with could be housed in one place. But from there, the next step is to make this data more accessible and usable and user-friendly. So this is where I'm now looking at digital platforms that will allow people to find the information, to look at the imagery, search the information, and so that it's functional and accessible. So that's sort of the pathway that I'm following. Okay, so moving on to the project goals and phases. I've probably said some of this already, so I don't need to look at every slide necessarily. But of course, the first was finding out what objects exist in South African collections, where are they, and what data exists about these objects or collections. So I was very interested in individual objects, studying trends and studying the collections, and also looking at the individuals who, by and large, donated objects to museums. So that was one of the trends that emerged. On the one hand, purchases and acquisitions were done by the museums themselves, and this was usually in the case of the more academic institutions. But in the state museums, there was a trend, especially in the 1930s, interestingly enough, 1930s, 1940s, of donations by individuals who had collected objects themselves, or just because they felt that a museum should have a collection of classical objects. So those were the kinds of trends I was looking at. Okay, so that was the first step, and that is ongoing as well as I uncover other information. So although these phases or steps, of course, I'm presenting as a sequence, it's not as neat as that. I have to very often, I'm going back a step to look for because I find something, or just I have to. I get a little bit further with one collection and then have to catch up with another collection. Depends on where the collections are as well, because I'm physically visiting them. All right, so the next step is preservation, as I said. So digitization puts the data into a database, collated together with any document scans, documents that I've got, photographs, any records that I've been able to gather. Then the analysis, as I said, collection biographies, timelines as well, to see if it's at certain times particular objects were preferred. So I wasn't sure what patterns would emerge, but and I'm still processing that data in that way. So I have some patterns and trends, but there's more to emerge from that. And then the data publication, as I said. So I think a word that is being used at the moment is digital unshelving. So although the objects themselves are not on display, you can make the data accessible, you can make the objects accessible through this wonderful thing, which is digital humanities. So there's a map of South Africa, and I've just put little stars at the sites where I have found collections. And so I am quite sure that there are some small collections. I haven't looked at private collections, but in some small regional museums, I'm quite sure there are objects that I haven't yet found. I've checked in the major museums, and in some of them, they're just a handful of objects, which I've also recorded, but I'm quite sure that there are some other objects in other state museums that I'm yet to find. But I'm sure I have found the biggest collections. So this is a list, and please don't worry about all the writing. This is just to show you that I found this trend of very clearly there were two types of collections. And so you can see that I've found about, how many is that? 20 odd collections in South Africa, which was very surprising to me. I have to say, I felt very uninformed when I discovered how many museums had collected classical objects at some point, and how many of them had now put them away. So that was part of it. So the Cape Town collection, I'm going to show you a quick overview of the kinds of trends. And I won't look at every single slide because I think that will take us too long. But I just want to show you the types of things that we find in these collections and just some of the data that I have collected. So the Ezekiel Collection, there's a very fine selection of Attic pottery. So this is very impressive ware. This was a donation by a gentleman who donated other things to museums in South Africa. And these are really world class. So these are not just bits and pieces that a museum happened to collect because somebody just dropped off a little object that they bought in London or something. So these are really fine objects. And as I said, they are a donation. And this is one of the cases where the gentleman, Alfred de Pas, decided that a museum, a state museum, should have these fine objects of Greece and Rome. He also donated Chinese pottery, and Persian pottery and other things. So these civilizations should be represented. So just to roughly give an overview, in that collection, excluding coins, which I haven't yet managed to include, there are about 240 artifacts, and it's extremely varied. So there are some things, so there's Roman glass, there are lots of everyday items, as I call them, such as a strigil, which is used to remove oil and grime from the skin, surgical instruments, small implements. These are popular in the South African collection. So I can say that virtually every collection has some surgical instruments or small metal items, as well as coins. And I think this has a lot to do with them being so portable and easy to transport and to collect. So the bigger pieces are, of course, much more difficult logistically and more expensive. All right, many of these were acquired through donations or bequests. And at the start of the project, surprisingly, there were no electronic records of these collections. So despite it being one of the main museums in the country, this collection, the Ezekiel Collection, the classical pieces had not yet been added to a database. So we found lots of information. We found acquisitions, registers, handwritten. We found minutes and memos. We found catalog cards. There were 2 catalogs that were produced. This one, which was the Durbin Collection, to celebrate the donation. And John Boardman, who is a vase specialist, wrote about the Greek vases in Cape Town. So he did a small, a little booklet on that. And then at the top of the screen, you can see one of the cards, the catalog cards for an object. And you can see what kind of information we have been dealing with. So far from very clear records and digital records, many of our records looked like this, if they even had that much information on them. So information that was crossed out, that was amended, and sometimes just completely blank. So this was actually quite a useful card. And all of these cards have been scanned and are now part of the database. So this is the kind of thing I want to be part of the database, that it's multimedia. It's not just information, but we actually have the original scans as well, because who knows what will happen to those cards, and they are a part of the story of the collection as well. So the Durbin Collection, actually more objects. They have a very good collection, but this does include loans from other Durbin museums, which did not want to carry on displaying the objects. So this was a museum that started in the 70s, and that was the head of department bought a cup, and then they decided they were going to turn it into a museum for academic purposes. Also, many small objects like daily items, loom weights, small figurines. And that's because, again, they are affordable and they are easy to get sent. They're not difficult to transport. So the museum kind of kept its sights on mainly smaller objects. And at the start of the project, there were no electronic records at all. There were just handwritten acquisition registers like this. This has also been scanned as part of the database. So these are really incredibly rich in information. They even have the prices that were originally paid. They have dimensions. They have information about the painter, if it's a vase, for example. So we really do have a rich record for this collection. Also in Durban, there's another university. This is on the right-hand side at the top is one of my students, Samantha as well, Graham. And she wrote about the Durbin collections. And so she collected a lot of the data for me. There she is with the manager of the collection. They are not on display. That is where they were on display, that cabinet, the empty cabinet in the library at the university, but they're no longer on display, and some of them have been loaned to the university museum. So yeah, we don't need to look at all this data, but again, no electronic records. There were just handwritten minutes and memos and records such as these. Okay, so I think you're getting a sense of the types of collections that we have in South Africa and the types of records. So all of these are part of the database. I'm just going to scroll through. I'm not going to talk about all of them because you have got the idea. Incidentally, the Stellenbosch collection of coins, of mainly Roman coins, is the only collection that actually had a presence on the web. And this was before my time. There is a web page connected to our website that gives information about each of the coins. So that was really very useful to have all that data electronically already. Our university also has some small objects following similar patterns to the collecting practices of other museums. And we had a list in Word. So that was the extent of the information about the objects. In the Eastern Cape, there are other collections. Bay World is one of the not university, a state collection, which mainly focuses now on the marine life, but it also has a curiosity corner. And this is what the director said, that these objects, there are a few objects that belong to an exhibit called the Curiosity Corner. Next to some of the Roman items is a dog embryo with 2 heads, which was quite astounding to me. I have not yet seen that collection. Also in the Eastern Cape, just to show you again, I'm just going to go over it quickly. About 100 objects at the Albany Museum. In this case, there were no electronic records, and all of the paper records were lost in a fire. So we had boxes that had a list like this of content. So this was still useful. We still had something, but nothing about where these objects had come from. So yeah, very little to go on. And so one of my students actually went there and took photographs, and we documented. So we were able to visit that collection, but it still needs to be photographed properly. At Rhodes University, there is a collection, mainly pottery. Also had a list in Word. In Johannesburg, a museum which was previously the Afrikaner Museum has some interesting objects. Quite a few of them are fragmentary. These are put away in a box. They couldn't find the box, and I had to go back to look. So most of these objects were in quite poor condition, and so this is one of the glass pieces which has fragments, many fragments, just put in envelopes and boxes. As I said, not in the greatest condition, but they did have a list in Word as well. And in Pretoria, where Francisca and I have been recently, these are not the photographs we took. I didn't have time to put them in, but several objects this is also a National Museum of Cultural History, just like Ezekiel. And not that many objects, more objects in the area of Egypt. And here they actually had an Excel document and a Word document as well. So we had some digital data to start off with that we could input. Okay, so that's just an overview of some of these collections. So what kinds of records, just to summarize, we had 2 published catalogs for Ezekiel. We had lists in a Word. We had catalog cards which were handwritten, mostly. And then acquisitions registers, also mostly handwritten. Minutes of meetings where items were mentioned or documented, or decisions to buy the objects, memos, letters between departments, and some photographs as well. We did have some photographs to use. So all of this was collected and scanned. So this is one of the photographs of the old setup in the Greek room at Ezekiel. So these historical photographs are very valuable too, to represent how the objects were curated at that time. Okay, so that brings us to the probably more important stuff for this audience, is the digitization process. So being not very well or not very computer literate, especially at the time, my first step was just creating a Word document where I collected information such as where were the collections, what kinds of or how many objects were there. And a lot of this was guesswork. This was right at the very beginning. The dates acquired, how they were acquired, the current status, whether there was a digital list or where the actual objects were, if they were in storage or if they were on display, any publications related to them, contact people. So this was really just an information collection of information, but nothing about specific objects. We then started a more sophisticated Excel document, and this is information specifically from the Ezekiel Collection. So here we had certain fields, and this was largely dictated by Ezekiel itself, because what we did is 2 of my students went to Ezekiel, and we offered them the service of digitizing this collection. And so we did it according to fields that were useful for them. So they weren't necessarily the fields that we wanted to set up at that point. But you can see things such as a number, museum number, what type of object it was, more specific description of the object, if it was a ceramic vessel, what kind. They were also interested in original artworks or replicas, so that was also included. Which collection it was part of, the Antiquities collection in this case. And to track the collection history and look at trends related to collecting. The museum input that information into their major database, which is called Logos Flow, and I have no idea if they still use it. But my students helped with that data input and said that it was not user-friendly at all. They really didn't like it. So in a way, the Excel sheet was the most useful thing, spreadsheet or repository at that point. We also experimented with FileMaker, and the reason for this is that our university had a license for FileMaker Pro, and Professor Cornelius, who is the Egyptologist in our department, he really likes FileMaker Pro, and so he showed us how to use it. And it looks like this. It looks like a kind of catalog card. So each object has an entry, and you can customize the fields. And so that's what we did. We decided what did we need, what kind of information did we want, where is it from, time period, what is the object, a type and a subtype, techniques, information about the function of the object. And this was Sam Graham that I showed you earlier, who looked at the Durbin collections. She used this kind of this repository to collect her data. So at that point, this database. However, a negative with this type of database is that anybody who wants to use it has to have FileMaker Pro. They also have to have it to be able to access it. And then we moved on to, from our Excel sheet, we collated the collections and converted them to a Google Sheet on Google Drive. And that is the point where we are with the database itself as an entity. So it looks like this. I was going to try and go online, but I think it's going to be, with my Wi-Fi situation, a little bit tricky. So I'm just going to show you some screenshots. But it's not very attractive. As you know, Google Sheets or Google Drives look like this. And maybe there's more one can do, but it's functional. And so we divided, we have several folders, starting off with general notes and style sheet. So list of goals and individual objectives, and which we could share. The collections themselves, so information and photographs related to the collections, and then the mega database itself, the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet looks something like this, and it's very long. So I'm going to show you 3 screenshots to go all the way across. And that is one of the disadvantages of it. You can't look at it and take in a lot of information about an object at the same time. You have to scroll across. And so it's good as a repository. You can collect a lot of information. You can share it. Well, you can share it, but you can, of course, search. So it's searchable. And what we did is, on the left-hand side, you can see we gave each object a unique number, South African classical antiquities database number. So each of the objects have a number. We include the institution, of course, the institution ID. Those numbers, depending on the institution, and even at institutions, they have different numbering systems depending on dates when they acquired objects. So those numbers are quite complicated, and we decided that it would be a good idea to give the objects an identity, a number in our a name object as the description of an object, the category, the type, the shape, the material, dates, which for some objects we have not yet gone in. Well, a lot of this information is still to come. We still have to study these objects more fully. We then included the description that the institution gave. And that was interesting because sometimes the description was quite incorrect. So at first we were just including the institution description, all my students were, and then I insisted that we include our own description, but I wanted to keep track of how the institution had described it, because that kind of also interesting. So it goes on 2 more screenshots. other information with links to photographs. Photographs are in the drive as well, and it's a real mix of photographs of rather poor photographs taken through the cabinet and the visuals so that they will be really very good. Hopefully.
Okay, so I think we have lost Samantha, unfortunately, but she was at the end of the presentation in any case, I think. So, okay, we see if we can join back. And okay, wait just a minute. Unfortunately, she has problems with her connection, but in any case, we have been able to follow her today. So I think that slides and the audio were okay. So
in the meantime, Francisco, is there anything you wanted to? Oh no, she's back.
Were donated, and how many were picture.
Samantha,
this is where we
Samantha.
got the information that most of the objects were donated, so that on the right-hand side, that tall column is donated objects. Certainly in the State Museum, there was not a very strong and deliberate purchasing policy. Okay, so where we currently are, the public interfaces, South Africa, Greece, and Rome, the book. This is what Francisco was talking about earlier. This is the digital museum, where we have taken any objects or discourse or anything of some kind of material quality and uploaded these into the digital museum. So especially where they are connected with the book. So they are objects of reception in many instances. The ancient objects. And this between classics in South Africa over time. So it's very record of the antiquity. There are things in which photography related is they put on a
Samantha,
and it's very interesting to think about
here. Samantha, can you hear us? Because we have a few problems now with our audio. Just the last 5 minutes were a bit problematic. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Now we can hear you again. So okay. So you were talking about the Stanford collection. So yes, okay. So you can go on, because we couldn't really hear you in the last 2-3 minutes.
Okay, sorry about that. And just how much longer should I speak for?
Well, I think that maybe, I don't know if maybe we can stop now to see if there are questions, and we can see if your connection better. I'm sorry. So we could. So the entire session was very good. I mean, we could follow your slides, and your audio was perfect. Just the last 5 minutes were a bit. Sometimes we lost you, and now I don't know. I see that. Okay, so maybe we can stop here, and then maybe we can go back, because we still have 30 minutes. So definitely we have time to maybe to finish these slides, or maybe I don't know.
So would you like me to go back a few?
Yes, maybe as for now, I remove your screen and I see if I don't know if your audio is better again. But in any case, you can hear us, if I understand, so you can understand us. Well, maybe
Yes,
okay. So okay, okay, good. So let's start with a discussion, because definitely you presented many interesting things, and I think we can open the discussion. And then in any case, we still have time, so maybe at the end of the session you can still talk about your last slides. In any case, first of all, thank you very much, because you presented really very interesting collections, and I see that there are, if I understand, a total of 19 collections in total, between state collections and university collections.
Hello, sorry.
Yeah. Can you hear us or not? So if maybe you can write in the chat, in the private chat, and we can read you. So I think this is better, because I think that now we really have issues. Okay.
Yeah, I think the main issue is that there's a several second lag in between Samantha speaking and our hearing her, or vice versa, and that we just need to pause after we ask a question.
Yes. So, well, I think we can open the discussion now. I mean, commenting, because there are really interesting things. So, and maybe Samantha, if you want, you can try to join us again, this StreamYard room, because it's open. So anyway, we can start with a few comments, and I don't know, Francisca, if you want to add something or not, or we can open the discussion. So let me know.
Yeah, I would just highlight the fact, thank you very much, Samantha. This is really rich material, and I have to admit that even though we work together so closely, there's a couple of facts that I wasn't aware of, especially at the state of digitization in these museums. So it's very disparate and centered on certain donations, and it's different for even one museum as a whole. And that actually the universities here are doing the work that one would also consider would be the work of the museums, but of course they also have different roles. And another thing I would like to stress again is that the aspect of reception plays such a huge role in the Southern Cape, that also artifacts are collected that have some classical imagery or relate in some sense to the ancient world next to the ancient artifacts. Yeah. So these are two aspects I would like to stress, and let's see, maybe there's questions in YouTube so far.
Well, I think that the first thing important in general for our program and our students in general. So first of all, so we have been able to today we have been able to see specific collections in a specific country, South Africa, with certain issues. But in any case, thank you for this presentation, Samantha, because we could see a situation which is similar to many other museums. I mean, where we have objects and we have many other materials like cards, notes, etc. So this is where a collection starts in any case. And we have been able also to see the beginning of, let's say, a digital project, which is a complex thing. First of all, we have to travel to different museums to look for these objects, and we know that this is not easy in any museums in the world. So looking for objects first to see where they are, and then look for the history of these collections. So I think this is really a very interesting aspect. And then, of course, the digitization. So we have seen the beginning of this let's say database, and as we have seen, so you start with with an Excel file. Humanists use this, and then now you have let's say Google spreadsheet. Well, yes, this is one of the first principles of the linked open data. Okay, let's start with well, possibly not a proprietary format, maybe not Excel, but CSV file, so you can export your Google spreadsheet or your Excel in a CSV file, and then from that move on with a bigger database. But I don't know if there are, and Samantha, I see that you are back. I don't know if you can hear us or.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, in the meantime, we were discussing about your presentation. And I don't know if also if Gabriel has other questions, and please, please, Gabby, please.
Yeah, I had one fairly. I mean, apologies if you mentioned this, but and thank you for this extremely exciting presentation. It was a project I knew nothing about, and it's really interesting to see. Also the, in particular the modern history of these collections, which is really interesting, and as all collections are, but especially with the sort of complex, sort of colonial background to them. I find that really fascinating. I wondered. My question is. Some of the digitized objects that you showed us, and I'm thinking in particular of images of the museum cards of the handwritten accession records and letters and things like this that were part of the collection, and the part, as you said, of the modern understanding of these collections. Are those images and those objects things that you also plan to make fully open access and publicly available as part of this publication? And a subsidiary question to that is, if so, are there any potential problems with that? Are there any limitations, things you might want to redact, ethical issues with any of that that might occur as part of that decision?
Thank you. That's a very good question. No, I'm not planning to put everything onto the public, the repository that has the public interface. And there are things such as the value of objects, which museums would definitely not want. Even things such as donations and bequests and that kind of information, which some people might be sensitive about. And that is why the Google Sheet that I have, which has a lot of information, is not the one that I want to make the accessible one, because it also contains a lot of boring information that people would not want to look at all. But the ethical issues are important. And so there are things that I agree would have to be considered very carefully. And also I would be in conversation with the institutions themselves to, of course, get permission to use those pieces of data. So it is a very good question, and I don't yet have a policy for it because we're not that close at the moment. I didn't get that far, but we have some objects on something called Notion, which a student of mine has helped me to put together. And if that is a platform where you can, like a website, which would show an object and then just give certain information about the object, like the key information, the shape and the date and information that is not controversial at all. And that is the kind of thing that I want to develop. Notion, however, I don't think it has some problems. And this is why I had to admit at the beginning that I'm not very in touch with contemporary real digital humanities, and I'm finding my way. So I'm going to be asking Francisca a lot of questions to help me out, because she and I haven't spoken about the Notion development. So this is something that a student has come up with, and I have a demo which I'm not sure if I can share here, but I can share the website address, and it looks very nice, and it doesn't have anything controversial, and I have permission from the museums to show those objects. Yeah, so I'm interested in your views on what that kind of data, those kinds of cards, whether those could be controversial, or what is your view about that kind of thing?
Thank you. Yeah, no, those were exactly the sorts of things I was thinking about, the sorts of things that sometimes museums are sensitive about, and or, quite rightly, and also those things that, the distinction between what we're legally under, intellectual copyright law allowed to publish, and yet, things that we might choose not to for other non-legal reasons. So yeah, I think the sorts of issues you talked about, cost, personal information and bequests, those sorts of things were exactly the sort of things I was thinking of.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question.
Thank you.
Well, yes, and definitely something that we have been learning in the digital humanities. So first, let's start with the basic, let's say. So in this case, of course, there are many complex things. There are many objects, many collections, different situations, and then many controversial things. And then, of course, you need, I guess, a discussion with each collection to see what you can, let's say, publish or not. But at least let's start with a collection or a database with the objects, so to keep track of them when possible, with pictures. And then, of course, I don't know if you can, of course, publish a picture of each of them. Of course, then taking pictures. This is just the first thing. So to travel around and get pictures, and then in any case to insert in your database entries with metadata first, which is something that can be complex, so to define a structure, and then possibly following the linked open data principle. So first of all, have, let's say, a database at least as a CSV format, so not proprietary, and then of course is your decision if you want to publish it, because we have two issues here. One, to make it open in the sense that everyone can visualize it and use it, but the other side is to use open standards. I mean, that standards that in the future will allow people to use your data. So open, we know that open means two different things. The important thing is to generate data that can be used by you, by your project, and other people in the future. And so this is the first thing. And then a second important thing, we know to have, let's say, identifiers for your object, machine-readable identifiers. Of course, we have different collections. We know that for inscriptions, for papyri. So in the community, there are different projects for working with objects and building basically databases with identifiers and metadata. So these are the three main issues with these collections, and then progressively move on. Of course, making cards, notes available in the future would be fantastic, because they are part of the history of these collections, and they already include metadata. I mean, information about these objects, not only the history of these collections, but also metadata about each object, the place where they were found or bought, or the material, etc. So these are definitely questions for the future. But for the beginning, yes, definitely. And then, as you said, let's start with with things that are not controversial, definitely. Which is not an easy question to answer. I mean, what do we mean by non-controversial? Yes.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in working out exactly what you said, the international standards, and that it is a sustainable, that this information can remain accessible. So you have the correct vocabulary, I don't, but that's exactly what I need to move to in the next step. And this program, or this, I guess it is a database of sorts, Notion, it's, I don't know the answer to that with Notion. So it looks very nice, but I don't know how it fulfills those kinds of standards for being sustainable. Also, as far as I know, it's not easy to export the data from Notion. It's not very easy to do. And so that to me is quite problematic. So it will be usable for now, as long as Notion is alive. And if Notion crashes, that's a bit of a problem for my database. So these are, very basic questions that I have to yet discover the answers to. And that's why I'm still learning about how to keep this data safe and make it more accessible.
Something I would like to add, which already exists, though it's just the Google spreadsheet, are the identifiers, not persistent identifiers, but at least identifiers that can be put into records and then being made persistent. And we also implement an ontology, an established vocabulary, the Getty vocabulary that some of you might be familiar with, because it's an ontology describing terms of especially archaeology and art history. And during the process of entering objects, I only did this for a few objects, but I found this really versatile. And I also found it especially for Greek objects, or the ones that I was entering. It was pretty straightforward and covered a lot of terms, so that was really feasible in that regard. And Monica, since you mentioned interesting genres that we would like to cover, to add into the database, so not just the objects themselves in the digital representation, but also cards and things, I came across something when what I wasn't familiar with when Samantha and I went to Pretoria to the Ditsong Museum, and they have a couple of Egyptian artifacts. And these artifacts came with some statements, so certificate-like pieces of paper, documentation, that assure the originality of these objects, that they're really genuine from Egypt. They come up with numbers, with a find spot, a provenance, a date when this was found, with the statement that this is really genuine, a rough dating to a year or an Egyptian dynasty of the pharaohs, and some rough description in handwritten form. So the forms themselves were printed, but the information for each object for which this was required is handwritten. This is quite interesting, and it refers to certain antiquity dealers in Cairo, including their locations. And it's very interesting to track down these dealers, because in Egyptology, some research and papyrology has been done about these individuals, and this is some task for the future to look at it. And at first sight, when we looked at these things and documentation, all the find spots are usually like the top 10 highlight find spots. And it's always the most important periods, the most popular periods of ancient Egypt, and it was always found near the pyramids. So this could definitely not be true. And this also goes a little bit in regard that a lot of museums sometimes also have, where we really have a hard time distinguishing, are these fakes or not? Because sometimes you just have ancient artifacts which are not of the first and foremost quality. And there's also lots of what we call objects of reception, so copies of and plaster casts of stele and things. And yeah, so these certificates of authenticity are a really interesting genre also to work on. This is something that we want to do in an upcoming publication, to integrate some of these. But of course, we cannot just put these up online, because they contain a lot of information which would be ethically problematic. But just to give you an idea what we're dealing with, and this is an interesting genre I myself didn't come across so far.
Do you think that the very presence of a certificate of authenticity itself is a red flag?
That was actually my first impression, but I really need to do more research into that. And those who are interesting colleagues listening here, there's an interesting book also available open access by our colleagues in Copenhagen, Kim Riehold and Fredrik Hagen, who put together a book about antiquities and especially papyrus dealers in the 20th century from Denmark and beyond. So check that out. And this is something I'm definitely also going to have a look at. And since this is also, of course, now an ongoing discussion with the recent developments in papyrology, and we have to say the last days, following up on Louvre and some other institutions.
Yes, thank you, Francisca, for this note. This is very interesting. This is the reason why, of course, we need to collect this information, okay, to look for the history of these collections, how those objects arrive in a certain country, also when it was still possible to buy them legally. I mean, of course, these we know are problems we know for every collection, basically every collection in the world, and definitely today that we want to produce these digital data, we have also to deal with these pieces of information. And this is not only a question of publishing them, but how can we structure, for example, a database to include this information? And you mentioned the ontology that you are using. Again, there is a lot of work there to look for the vocabulary for representing these objects, for adding metadata, and then publishing them. So this is the first work that has to be done. Yes, and okay, also for our audience, so please, I see that there are people in YouTube. If you have questions, you know that you can write your question in the chat in YouTube, and so we can answer your questions as far as we can. And in the meantime, you also have the class outline provided by Samantha for this session, where you have not only a description of the session, but also readings. And there is an open access also reading, so you can access it, about classical antiquities in South Africa. And then you also have a link to the Stanford exhibit, and that you can use also for your exercise. Okay, I don't know if there are other questions, and okay, I don't know if okay, yep, Debbie.
I was also interested in the question of the history of display of some of these objects, and obviously can't resist asking about the two-headed dog embryo, which is absolutely classic of the sort of cabinet of curiosities sort of view. And I wonder, maybe slightly more seriously, if the juxtaposition of any of these objects in their original display, in their original collection context, with other objects that are not as safe, let's say, from a post-colonial perspective, as Greek and Roman antiquities, and even Egyptian to some degree, although that's less more problematic already. But display of these things alongside, or collection of them alongside, or donation by the same people who also had African antiquities, things, or even not antiquities, right? Things that are clearly much more problematic to hold and display. And if that juxtaposition is anything you ever see, and if so, is that something that impacts on the way we might be comfortable in reporting these objects?
One very interesting case is the Ezekiel Collection and the way in which the antiquities were originally presented. First of all, they were part of the South African Museum, which was really just a huge cabinet of curiosities. So it had things such as rock from the local landscape and butterflies and all kinds of artifacts from around the world that had, fairly eclectically put together. And however, objects that were made by local communities were separated from the objects that were collected that were said to be from civilized societies. And this is a very clear distinction that remains when the Cultural History Museum, then breaks away from the South African Museum. All of the objects that are from China or Japan or Egypt, Greece, Rome go to the Cultural History Museum, and all of the objects made by local communities stay with nature at the South African Museum. And not only that, but the museum set up dioramas with people, figures that were cast from actual human beings, which is, of course, now highly controversial, and they've been taken away. But dioramas showing, presenting the local people using their things. And so that is a very problematic kind of division, which has been noted and discussed. And now in the current situation where many things are stored in the Social History Center, there was actually almost a ceremonial moment where the curator, Esther Ismail, she told me that for the first time we actually have African pots and Greek pots in the same space, occupying drawers, or cupboards in the same space. And that was quite significant. So I think from colonial days, the minutes of the annual report of the museum would always comment on acquisitions. And so I've read the annual reports for years and years and years, and that terminology was explicitly used: civilized and uncivilized. And everything locally produced by local indigenous people was uncivilized, and therefore with the natural habitat closer to nature. So I think that the fact that these objects were separated out, whereas other civilized societies, so-called civilized societies, their objects could be displayed together in another space, is highly significant, and that remained well until till the change, till the Cultural History Museum was basically abandoned and it became the Slave Lodge. So there is no Cultural History Museum, so to speak, in Cape Town. The objects are used at various sites where there's an appropriate exhibition that is on. They might be integrated, but most of those objects that were in the Cultural History Museum are actually in storage. So yeah, curation and ideology is very interesting, and that was part of the story that I wanted to track, because I was looking for display and just how that had affected the way in which purchases were done or objects were acquired, but also the way in which they were presented to people. Another thing to add is that museums were actually not open to people of color in South Africa, and so there was a very restricted viewing audience as well. They were also centered in places that were predominantly white city centers due to group areas. And so, yeah, very, very problematic and not very accessible to the most of the population, actually. But now Ezekiel I think they've done an excellent job. So I think the birth of the Slave Lodge to replace the Cultural History Museum is a really good thing. And I am able to access the antiquities with my students. It would be very nice if there could be some kind of museum where multiple objects of different cultures could be shown, but there just isn't space, there isn't money, there are other priorities. and I can live with that. And that's why the digitization is so important too.
Thank you very much for this very, very, very important comment, Samantha. Of course, we have not mentioned now the problem of colonialism and all these things, but I think that again we have another question about accessibility. So today we talk about accessibility, open access or not. Well, these are problems of accessibility. Definitely many different problems of accessibility for the objects and then also for visitors. So you mentioned really very important issues, and we hope that digital collections will allow us to go beyond these problems. We know that there are issues also in the digital era, but at least we try to go beyond them. And for example, this program is just a very small contribution to try to make people aware of these issues. Here there are multiple issues, ethical issues, but also concrete problems. For example, lack of funds for exhibiting collections, for producing also digital data, because definitely producing digital data is expensive in terms of money and people, because we need people, we need students, we need expert people, and then we need money, of course, because digital data are not just free, they are expensive. Of course, they can get a bigger goal than printed or physical collections, but still these are issues that we know. So so this last note was really very, very important, I mean, and we tried, of course, in previous sessions, and Gabriel Baudard led different sessions in the past in Sunoikis about digital cultural heritage, where similar questions were, of course, asked and addressed. We don't have a definitive answer, but at least we tried in the past to discuss these things. I don't know if there are, we still have 1 minute, and I don't know if there are other comments.
I'm actually curious about one thing, and I really can't hold myself back now because I'm really curious. Sam, you have covered basically state museums, university museums, but there must be a lot of ancient artifacts, I think, also in private acquisition. And the only thing that comes to my mind is something you have listed, the Glenelly wine estate that I was also now finally able to visit. This is a wine estate of European descent from France, and they have a huge glass museum, actually one of the largest collections of glass from ancient times until contemporary art. So that's quite interesting. And of course, you are familiar with this collection, so that's just something that I know, but you must have maybe some speculations or ideas if, yeah, some of the wealthier people might also adorn their houses with artifacts from the ancient world because it belongs to colonial representation in some way, or also to other imagery. What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. In the Glenelly Museum, I've only included because it is a museum and it is on display and it is accessible, whereas other private collections, they aren't accessible. And I think nobody would want me poking my nose if the other museum information is can be private. Then the private collections, I don't think anyone wants them out there. I do know that there are private collections, and in Cape Town there is. I've heard about a collector who has pottery. And as you say, some of the wealthier inhabitants of South Africa seem to have some objects. I think coin collections are also known to be in private collections, but I definitely have stayed away from the private collections. But I agree with you, Francisca, definitely. And objects in families that would have been inherited, because there was very much a moment when gentlemen did the great tour and traveled around, as Europeans did. Young South African men would go to Europe, and they would probably pick up some objects. I don't know if literally or buy them, but possibly a bit of both, and bring them back. And then, so those are some of those objects have ended up at Ezekiel, for example, or in the state museums because they've been bequeathed or donated by families. But I think in other cases, the families still have those objects. And we could probably ask lots of questions about how ethically they were acquired, but those definitely exist because it is within the same tradition as you're saying. Like the British country houses that have objects that are displayed and are a sign of culture. Similarly, in South Africa, the transportation is harder. That's one of the things that might count against things like statuary, but I have seen small-scale statuary at a house in Cape Town, which is part of a private collection, not a huge collection, but I have seen an object that is Roman, and it was in a private person's house, and it was a bust, so it wasn't extremely large.
Yes, we know stories about bigger objects that were basically made in pieces to bring them in other countries. But anyway, okay, this is a well-known problem about private collections, and maybe in the future we'll be able also to keep track of those collections. Anyway, so our time is over. Samantha, thank you very much for this session. It was great to really know about these collections. And again, at least officially we have, as I could see, 19 collections. So really a very interesting cultural heritage and a lot of work now. And, there is a community, a digital classics community, as we call it, within the digital humanities. And so I think that there are various people you can ask. And of course, you have Franziska. She can help you. And also in our sessions in the past, we tried to cover various aspects for producing, for collecting, for producing digital databases, for objects. So there is a lot of work now. So you can find that you have a community so for trying to help you and answer your questions. Okay, but now, unfortunately, we have to end our session. Next week, we don't have a session. So on June 16, we don't have a session. We will have a session again on June 23. And then we will have 3 sessions, and our last session is on July 7. But again, the class outline is in GitHub with readings, and then I will ask Samantha and Franziska to upload also your slides because they are really rich of information and material. Okay, so thank you again, Samantha, for joining us today. Thank you, Franziska, for this session, and see you in 2 weeks, on June 23. Not next week, but in 2 weeks. Okay, bye, good night.